Whitney Houston is without doubt one of the greatest voices the world has ever heard. The American superstar broke countless records in the 80s and 90s, sold at least 100 million albums, and achieved the biggest selling soundtrack ever with The Bodyguard. Whitney was quite simply one of the biggest stars the world has ever seen. But who really was Whitney Houston? What were her family and her upbringing like? How did she get her big break? Why did she achieve such an impact with her music career, and why does she still command so much interest to this day? Who was Robin Crawford? And what was the truth about her drug addiction and untimely death in 2012? So many questions, let's find out. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born in New Jersey in 1963, the daughter of legendary backing singer Cissy Houston and John Houston, who at the time was a taxi driver but had aspirations of becoming a high-powered music manager. Whitney was their second child together after Michael, who had been born 2 years previously. Both John and Cissy had been married before and each had a son from those marriages. Cissy's first son and Whitney's half-brother Gary grew up with the family. John's divorce wasn't finalized until 1964, the year after Whitney was born, and he and Cissy got married soon after. Cissy was regularly away from home touring and performing, trying to earn a living. She sang backup for legends such as David Bowie, Luther Vandross, and even Elvis Presley. Whitney came from a family with an amazing musical pedigree. Her mother was a professional singer, her cousins were Dionne and Dee Dee Warwick, and Aretha Franklin was a close family friend. Her dad John later became a manager of gospel groups and also worked for the Newark Council. After a few years, the family moved a short distance away from Newark to the more affluent East Orange. John nicknamed his daughter Nippy after a character from a comic strip who was always getting into trouble. Whitney, for the most part, seemed to be a happy child. She was very close to her two older brothers, but was regularly bullied in school for being light-skinned. According to Cissy Houston's book, Whitney decided age 12 that she wanted to be a professional singer. Her mother agreed to help her on the condition she had to rehearse every day and sing with the choir every Sunday. Her mother coached her intensely and has admitted to being incredibly tough with Whitney during those years. Both parents were heavily involved in their daughter's burgeoning music career, doing all they could to help her succeed in the music industry. As a teenager, Whitney was already doing backing vocals for artists including Chaka Khan. And by the time she was 14, Cissy was bringing Whitney to sing with her at nightclubs such as Reno Sweeney's and Sweetwater's in Manhattan. Whitney would do backing vocals for Cissy, who occasionally would bring her daughter forward to sing duets and even do solos. And not only did Whitney have incredible singing talent which belied her tender years, she also had undeniable beauty. She was scouted by a New York modeling agency as a teenager and did a number of photo shoots, including the cover of Seventeen magazine. In 1980, when Whitney was 16, she met Robin Crawford. They were both working at a local summer camp at the time. Robin would go on to be one of the most influential and important people in Whitney's life. Soon after meeting, the two became inseparable, with Robin becoming a key member of Whitney's team in later years, working with her for almost 2 decades as an assistant and creative director. Whitney's family were devoutly religious and didn't accept Robin, who they knew was gay. There were even reports John Houston was willing to pay somebody to beat up Robin Crawford to scare her away from Whitney, a story which was corroborated by Gary Houston in the documentary Whitney from 2018. Whitney's parents separated in the early 80s, but they both continued to be heavily involved in their daughter's career. Cissy and John eventually got a divorce in 91, with John going on to marry for a third time soon after. Tired of the constant arguments between her parents, Whitney left her family home at the age of 18 and straight away moved in with Robin in New Jersey. Robin was her confidant and helped to helm the ship that was the business of Whitney Houston. In Nick Bromfield's 2017 documentary of the superstar, a member of Whitney's band says that in order to get to Whitney, you had to go through Robin. And the rumours about her sexuality were there right from the very beginning of her career. Her entire family were against the relationship with Robin, as was her mentor Clive Davis, who in his 2013 autobiography opened up about his own bisexuality. In the aforementioned book, Clive spoke about the interest in Whitney's private life at the time. The rumours about her being gay persisted. She denied them, and I knew of various boyfriends that she had. But the rumours never abated, and I know Whitney found them disturbing. Whitney was discovered by Arista A&R man Jerry Griffiths, who'd been monitoring her fledgling career for some time. He alerted the head of the label, Clive Davis, about this exciting new talent. Clive first came to see Whitney perform as part of Sissy's show at Manhattan nightclub Sweet Waters. The night Clive Davis discovered Whitney, she sang, coincidentally, The Greatest Love of All and Home, a song from the musical The Wiz. Clive Davis, as I'm sure you already know, is the legendary music man who signed Alicia Keys, Santana, Janis Joplin, Billy Joel and Bruce Springsteen, among countless others. In his book, he wrote about the night he discovered Whitney. Needless to say, Whitney blew the roof off Sweet Waters with those two songs, and I immediately determined to sign her. I could not believe that a teenager could bring such overwhelming passion to the greatest love of all. I sat there awestruck. That she was incredibly beautiful made the performance more magical. Elektra and Epic Records were also in the race at the time to sign Whitney, but of course Whitney signed with Arista and Clive, partly because he had already worked with Dionne Warwick and Aretha Franklin. Whitney signed the contract which was to change her life in April 1983. Clive believed she had the potential to be an all-time great, and over the course of Whitney's career, he was proven to be right. Soon after signing Whitney, she made her now legendary first TV appearance on The Merv Griffin Show, again singing Home from the musical The Wiz. It took Clive and Whitney almost 2 years to make her debut album, which alongside the arduous recording process involved the reviewing of hundreds of potential songs. Arista had a vision of creating a pop icon, someone who would appeal to a very mainstream audience. Anything that was too black sounding was sent back to the studio. We didn't want a female James Brown, said Arista's Kenneth Reynolds in the Can I Be Me documentary. According to Clive Davis, How Will I Know was originally written for Janet Jackson, but she turned it down. The album included 2 duets with another Jackson, Jermaine this time, who also produced 3 tracks on the album and who she apparently dated in the mid-80s. Whitney's debut album was released Valentine's Day 1985, and although it got off to a slow start, the album eventually went on to achieve phenomenal success. After taking 50 weeks to reach number 1, it ended up spending 14 weeks at the summit. It became the biggest selling female album of the 80s in the US, and its success was mirrored throughout the world, including the UK where it reached number 2. Whitney had 3 consecutive US number 1s off the album, including The Greatest Love of All, Saving All My Love for You, and How Will I Know. A second album, Whitney, was released a little over 2 years later in 1987. It continued with the same formula as her debut. The album went on to sell 22 million copies worldwide. Following on from the 3 number 1s from her debut, the album spawned 4 number 1s in the US, including I Wanna Dance with Somebody, Didn't We Almost Have It All, So Emotional, and Where Do Broken Hearts Go, giving her more consecutive number 1s than the Beatles. And I Wanna Dance with Somebody was written by the same team as How Will I Know. Soon after Whitney broke through, John Huston took over as his daughter's manager and made himself CEO of Whitney's management company Nippy Inc. The entire Huston family were put on the payroll. Her older brother Gary was also employed as one of her backing vocalists, and Michael was a road manager. And her sister-in-law also worked for the company, and her mother was head of the foundation. For the first part of her career, Whitney projected a really clean-cut, wholesome image, and this was mirrored by her parents, John and Sissy, who still appeared together at public events even though they had been separated for years. Although superstardom brought huge rewards, it certainly presented new challenges for Whitney. Rumours were already swirling at the time that Whitney was gay, which she denied in a number of interviews. Whitney also faced a backlash from the black community. many of who felt Whitney's music was too white and that she had sold out. Some within the community gave her the nickname Whitey. And in 1989 at the Soul Train Awards, a ceremony which celebrates black R&B and soul music, Whitney was booed by the audience as her name was read out in one of the award categories, which of course must have been a devastating experience for her. It was also the night where she met her husband-to-be, Bobby Brown. In contrast to Whitney's clean-cut mainstream image, Bobby had street credibility and the respect of the black community. The events of that night and the adverse reaction from her community clearly influenced her third album, which took a much more obvious R&B direction. L.A. Reid and Babyface, who had worked on Bobby Brown's album Don't Be Cruel, were drafted in to update Whitney's sound. The album sales were propelled by two American #1s, the title track and All the Man That I Need, but overall the album sold about half of its predecessor. After her third album, Whitney decided to try acting. Of course, it was an enormous risk, and her mentor Clive Davis had grave concerns. Very few actors make the transition successfully, and a failure in the acting arena could cause serious damage to Whitney's career. But luckily she found the perfect project, or rather, it found her. By 91, The Bodyguard script had been handed around Hollywood for quite some time and originally was pitched as a vehicle for Diana Ross and Steve McQueen. In Cissy Houston's book, she says that Kevin Costner had sent Whitney the script for the movie, and Costner, who at the time was at the height of his career, was convinced Whitney was perfect for the role. Immediately after the I'm Your Baby Tonight tour ended in autumn 91, Whitney auditioned and got the part. The Bodyguard was a box office smash, and the soundtrack sent Whitney's career stratospheric. The lead single, I Will Always Love You, topped charts around the world, becoming one of the biggest selling songs ever, and spent 14 weeks at the pole position in the US. The Bodyguard is still to this day the biggest selling soundtrack ever, and in the top 10 biggest selling albums of all time. And in early 94, Whitney picked up the music industry's most prestigious prize, the Best Album Grammy for the soundtrack. Whitney married the bad boy of R&B, Bobby Brown, in 92. In the I Will Always Love You video, Whitney was 6 months pregnant. She was sitting down and leaning forward to hide her bump. Whitney made 2 more movies and soundtracks in the following years, achieving considerable success with Waiting to Exhale and The Preacher's Wife with Denzel Washington. But unfortunately, behind all the glitz and glamour, the reality was very different indeed, and stories of marriage problems and unpredictable behaviour began to appear in the media. Bobby Brown was regularly in trouble with the law, and there were countless stories of infidelity on his part. And Whitney was starting to cancel concert dates on a regular basis. But the full truth of Whitney's life at the time really only started to emerge years later. Cissy says in her book that at the time, at the recommendation of Clive Davis, John Huston and Robin Crawford went to Connecticut to visit a rehab for Whitney. But she didn't go on that occasion, and soon after she began recording her 98 album My Love Is Your Love, which saw Whitney taking a more modern R&B direction, with a number of tracks by legendary producer Rodney Jerkins. It also included the duet When You Believe with another superstar vocalist, Mariah Carey. The album got off to a slow start when it was released in late 98, but over the following 12 months it went on to become a huge global hit, selling over 10 million copies, driven mostly by the huge hit singles It's Not Right But It's Okay and the title track. The accompanying tour visited America and Europe and was a huge success. Whitney did manage to complete the tour, but there were a number of cancellations in America, which furthered speculation in the media that Whitney did indeed have a drug problem, but her team attributed the cancellations to throat issues. It was to be Whitney's last tour in America and her last successful tour altogether, and it also marked the end of Whitney and Robin's working relationship and friendship after 2 decades. And at the turn of the millennium, events in Whitney's life confirmed years of speculation in the media. Whitney's drug problem could now no longer be denied. At the beginning of that year, marijuana was found in her purse at an airport in Hawaii. Whitney fled the island before she could be arrested. And in March that year, Whitney had been booked to perform as part of a medley at the Oscars. But she was missing cues and her behaviour was erratic in rehearsals. And the Oscars ceremony is broadcast live. So producers decided they couldn't afford to take the chance. Whitney was fired from the performance by the musical director Burt Bacharach and replaced by country star Faith Hill. Needless to say, the news went all over the world. Whitney's Greatest Hits collection was released in May that year. It went to #1 in the UK and sold 1 million copies in the country. 3 singles were released, including a duet with George Michael, If I Told You That, and another with Enrique Iglesias, Could I Have This Kiss Forever. Things were quiet on the Whitney front until the following year when the superstar signed a $100 million recording contract with Arista to do 6 more albums, which frankly seems like complete and utter insanity. Why would anyone sign any artist struggling with serious drug issues to a record deal, let alone a deal with so much money at stake? Of course, Whitney never recorded 6 more albums, and the terms of the deal must have been renegotiated quietly at some point. And in September 2001, days before 9/11, Whitney sang at a tribute concert to Michael Jackson in NYC. But unfortunately, this time, it wasn't her performance that everyone was talking about, but her appearance. Whitney looked emaciated, and it was now more than apparent that something was very, very wrong. The following year, Whitney released Just Whitney, her first studio album without Clive Davis at the helm. It underperformed around the world and not one of the 4 singles released cracked the American top 40. The album tanked in the UK, one of Whitney's biggest markets. And then there was the infamous Diane Sawyer appearance, arranged to help promote the album. The primetime interview proved to be disastrous and was parodied and lampooned by comics for some time later and generated acres of bad publicity. L.A. Reid, in his autobiography, wrote about his experience of working with Whitney during that period. By the time I became involved with Whitney as the label head, her commitment to her career was very different to the young girl I'd met at the airport. But a lot had changed since I'd last recorded with her. Her work ethic wasn't the same, which came as a surprise. A Christmas album followed in 2003, which didn't really do much business, and after that not much was heard from Whitney again for a long time. And the early noughties brought more bad news for Whitney. Her elderly father, then in his 80s, filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against her. John Huston died 6 months later, whilst the lawsuit was still pending and the two never reconciled. In the Kevin MacDonald movie of Whitney's life, it's said that Whitney had fired her father a few years previously after discovering that he had been stealing from her. And in 2005, Whitney made the ill-advised decision to take part in her husband's cringe-worthy reality show, Being Bobby Brown. Thankfully, it was cancelled after 1 season. And in 2007, after 15 years of marriage, Whitney and Bobby divorced. In the Kevin MacDonald movie about Whitney's life, it says that after divorcing Brown, Whitney went to rehab, but she didn't have the money to complete the program. At that stage in her life, Whitney unbelievably had whittled away her entire multi-million-pound fortune. At that point, with Bobby Brown out of the picture and Whitney keen to tackle her drug issues, Clive Davis thought it was time to get Whitney back in the studio. I don't know if Whitney was really keen to make a comeback or if she just really needed the money, or maybe it was both. And in September 2009, her comeback album I Look To You was released and debuted at #1 in America. Of course, times had moved on and it was unlikely Whitney was going to be topping the pop charts again. But the lead single, written by Alicia Keys, was clearly a winner and was Whitney's first top 5 British single in a decade. And to accompany the album, Whitney agreed to go on tour for the first time in a decade. Demand for Whitney was still huge, but at this point her voice had been severely damaged by years of drug abuse. According to Kevin MacDonald's movie, Clive Davis begged her not to go on tour, but at that point, her management felt that without the money she would earn from the tour, Whitney would end up homeless. Whitney went ahead with the tour, but unfortunately it proved to be an unmitigated disaster. Her vocal performances were so poor there were walkouts at concerts in Australia, Denmark and England, with disgruntled fans understandably voicing their anger to the media. But should someone clearly so vulnerable have been put under that much pressure? And maybe she should never have returned to recording in the first place. It goes without saying the stress of that tour really can't have helped her addiction issues. Whitney passed away on the 11th of February 2012 after drowning in a bathtub in the Beverly Hills Hotel. The autopsy report listed cocaine and heart disease as contributing factors. She was just 48. Her daughter, Bobbi Kristina, passed away in similar circumstances 3 years later. My videos aren't really about artists' personal lives, but as drugs were the illness which plagued most of Whitney's adult life and ultimately led to her demise, I feel I need to include the subject of her drug use in this video. What I've learned in the years since her death is that Whitney's drug problems didn't begin with Bobby Brown or at the height of her fame. Whitney had started taking drugs as a teenager with her brothers, and all 3 of the Houston children had struggled with drug addiction. Speaking in the Nick Broomfield documentary Can I Be Me, Ellen LeVar, Whitney's long-term stylist, talked about meeting Whitney in her teens. When I met Whitney, we were 18, 19. They did drugs. Everybody did it and her brothers gave it to her. It was just something you do to have fun. In Kevin MacDonald's movie On the Late Star, Whitney's older brother Michael talked about how their drug taking got started. We were together most of the time. I taught her to drive, and everything you do together as you're growing up, and then when you get into drugs, you do that together too. Her older brother Gary had become a professional basketball player in his late teens, but was dropped by the NBA after testing positive for drugs. And she also writes in her book that Robin Crawford tried to warn her of Whitney's drug taking in the late 80s. In the book, she writes about that meeting. One afternoon in the late 1980s, Robin came to visit me. I was surprised since she and I never said much to each other, and I always tried to stay out of whatever was going on between her and my daughter. But Robin came to me because she was worried about Nippy. She told me that Nippy was using drugs, which was news to me. She said Nippy was doing it on occasion and that Nippy likes it a little too much. Apparently, if they had it in the house, Nippy would start and keep on going until everything else was gone. I might not have liked certain things about Robin, but I will say this. She cared a great deal for Nippy and she wanted to protect her. Nobody had the courage to come to tell me that Nippy was getting into something that was bad for her. Nobody except Robin. I always respected Robin for that. The drug taking continued into her adult life, and according to the Can I Be Me documentary, Whitney overdosed on cocaine whilst making Waiting to Exhale. Who knows exactly what was the root of Whitney's suffering? The enormous scrutiny she had to live under, a public image that she probably didn't feel connected to, the disappointment and betrayal she experienced at the hands of her family, or the fact Whitney more than likely was bisexual or fluid and she was never able to express that love freely or live her truth. In Robin Crawford's 2019 book, she confirmed that her relationship with Whitney was intimate on all levels. When Oprah asked Cissy Houston in an interview in 2013 if she would have had a problem if her daughter was gay, Whitney's mother responded with an emphatic absolutely. It's heartbreaking to think after everything Whitney went through, and even after her daughter's death, her mother still felt this way. After Whitney died in 2012, Bobby Brown was quoted as saying, "I really feel that if Robin was accepted into Whitney's life, Whitney would still be alive today. Whitney didn't have close friends with her anymore." Although Whitney is now long gone, she will go down in history as one of the greatest voices of all time. Whitney scaled dizzying heights few ever reach, but also experienced crushing lows. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of her life was that the woman who brought untold joy to millions the world over was never able to find it for herself. Soon after Whitney broke testing, and by the turn of the millennium, events in Whitney's life It took Clive and Whitney almost her elderly father, then in his 80s, filed a multi-million pound, no, not pound. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts on anything in this video, please leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos.